Live from the Glasgow Electric Plant Board, Glasgow Wants to Know. With your host, Mr. Uhel Barrickman.
Welcome to another of Glasgow Wants to Know. In the beginning tonight, I would like to clarify that this program is not recorded. It is being done live. It is not rehearsed. I have been asked by some people who have been watching it whether it was done live. The original, which this is live. It will be played several times again, but this one is live. Our subject tonight is whether the armed forces of the United States should be used for humanitarian purposes. Of course, this is a very pertinent subject at this time, as we shall find as we get further into the program. We're fortunate tonight in having two individuals on the program to discuss this subject who have had, or now having, one of them, as I understand, has had and is still active in the armed services. The gentleman sitting on my left is Dr. David Cooper, the pastor of the First Christian Church in Glasgow. He is a graduate of the Lexington Theological Seminary and holds a doctorate in ministry. He also is a graduate of the College of the Ozarks, which is in Missouri. On his left is Jolene Travis, who is a graduate of Western Kentucky University. He is also a graduate of the College of Law of the University of Kentucky. He has served on the Public Service Commission of Kentucky, and he also has served on the Board of Trustees of Western. First, I will ask Dr. Cooper to tell you his background militarily.
I am a U.S. Air Force Reserve chaplain, Lieutenant Colonel with the 251st Combat Comm Unit in Springfield, Ohio.
Mr. Travis, what's your military background?
Well, I'm a retired reserve officer, having served in the National Guard and active military and Army Reserve from my 17th birthday till my 60th birthday.
I believe you retired as
a Lieutenant Colonel.
And at one time served in the Judge Advocate General's Corps of the Army, which is the law field of the Army, as well as in the field artillery branch of the Army.
That's correct. I first enlisted in the Guard in Tompkinsville in the artillery. And then after we served in Korea, I attended and graduated from the artillery school. And then the advanced course at the artillery school. And when I finished law school, I enlisted in the Judge Advocate General's Corps for the regular Army observation tour and served at Aberdeen Proving Ground and attended the Judge Advocate General School at the University of Virginia, and served after that with the 101st Airborne Division, where I received my regular Army appointment. And then I left the Army and came to Glasgow to practice law.
And I believe you also served in Korea.
Served in Korea with the 623rd.
Now, Dr. Cooper, can you give us some idea of the active service which you've had?
No active duty. I've been in the reserve for 13 years. I have done active duty stints, brief stints, mostly annual tour kind of experiences in Spain and in Central America and Honduras, and that's where my experience with some humanitarian aid efforts of the military has taken place.
Would you care to elaborate a little bit on the type of humanitarian service that you did have there in those places?
Yes, the Guard in this country has been involved for over 10 years in Central America, in the remote hills of Central America, providing engineering support to that area, which is a very primitive area. The units from many of our engineering units here in the United States have been involved in building roads, a 90-mile section of roads since about 1983 or 4, I think. And along those roads, we have worked with the remote villages in helping the people in terms of drilling wells and building adequate schools for the children. Along with that, for the past 2 years, I worked with the Ohio Air National Guard in putting together humanitarian aid in terms of a couple of tons, 1 ton the first year and 2 tons the second year, of mostly school supplies and some clothing and cooking utensils, things that are very much needed for the very poor people who live in that part of the country with no running water and thatched roof huts and dirt floors. And our unit, as well as many units across the United States, have reached out to the people in terms of providing that kind of aid, as well as drilling the wells, building the road, and building the schools. So really our government, the idea of humanitarian aid through the military is not anything new. It's been going on for years.
I would remind the audience that we will be taking phone calls. If you have questions for either one of these gentlemen as we get further into this program, please call 651-1620. That's a new one on me, not the one we've been using. So again, I will repeat it, 651-1620. And we will take your calls, and please tell us to whom you are directing your question. Before we get further into this, perhaps we ought to come up with some idea or some definition of what we mean by humanitarian aid. Mr. Travis, what would you call humanitarian aid?
Well, it'd be certainly something different from what Colonel Cooper's just referred to, because I would take the steps that he's referred to by our engineers as similar to the same thing that Special Forces and others did in Vietnam in their pacification process. Because as I recall, those operations in Central America were anti-communist operations to strengthen those countries to prevent them being overrun by international communism. And that's not what I would refer to as humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid to me is something for the benefit of the welfare of a nation or a region or city or any particular government entity, similar to what's going on in Somalia now, more so than what went on in Central America in those days or what went on in Vietnam. I gather that's what we're talking about.
In other words, you're saying that welfare is dealing with human health and human happiness. Sure. and the general well-being of the population.
Social reform and welfare.
That's what you mean by humanitarian aid.
That's what I would take it to mean.
Now, do you agree with that, and do you go beyond that, Dr. Cooper?
Well, I think I agree with that. What we did was humanitarian aid and welfare for the people in Central America, and those efforts weren't just being done 10 or 15 years ago. The last 2 deployments that we had with that was in 1991 and 1992. Those were the ones I was involved with. And I suppose there could be a military or governmental agenda that hasn't been shared with me by the government or the military, but as far as I know, those operations that were done down there were done for the relief of the people and the aid to the people, and for the military training of our engineers in the kind of environments that they might find themselves in a war scenario. But we had to use both Honduran and American forces, U.S. forces, to provide security for us anytime we went out into the hillsides, and we traveled extensively over the hillsides.
Now, you spoke of training for our people under those types of circumstances. Did we also in turn train their troops and their engineers?
Yes. Part of the working force on the road crews, on the well crews, in the gravel and the quarry pits and the rock crews were Honduran civilians, and a part of the security force, at least, was Honduran military. I'm not aware if any of the actual working crews and engineers. I assume that some of them were, but I didn't really see that. But certainly there were. It was providing jobs for Honduran civilians. They were being trained in the use of the heavy equipment that was being used to build the roads and that kind of thing. So they were involved with it. They also provided support to the U.S. forces that were based there in terms of helping with food and supplies and those kinds of things. So it helped the economy, at least in the immediate area where these were being done.
But this was strictly Air Force?
No, sir. It was a joint forces effort with Army, active duty Army, active duty Air Force, active duty, or rather Reserve Army and Reserve Air National Guard.
And insofar as you know, there wasn't any training of our Army of their ground forces?
Not in any way that I saw or was aware of, no. Their ground support forces provided support for us. Anytime we went off base, when I went into the villages in these communities, we had to have it with us at least 2 armed Honduran military persons. And then we had all of our staff that went with me on these were also armed except myself.
So what you're saying is the services that were being provided were essentially for the infrastructure of that country by way of building roads and providing employment and things of that nature.
Yes, and the primary benefit for the United States Army and Air Force was the training of troops in the kind of environment that they would be operating to do the same things if they were in a war scenario.
Is that still going on as far as you know?
This year, the 90-mile stretch of road that had been worked on for 10 years was completed, and that program will not be done next year. But it has been being done every year during the off-rainy season for the past 10, I believe, or 11 years.
Do you have any information, either of your own knowledge or from other sources? I assume you still have contacts there.
In Honduras?
Yes, and with personnel that's still there?
No, most of our troops, most of the people that I went with were, of course, guardsmen, civilian soldiers, and they did their 2-week annual tour there, or some of them put in for extra duty and spent longer terms over there. But most of them were over there for 2 weeks, and they came back, another unit went in, and this revolved on for over a 6-month basis, starting about January and going until about May or June when the rainy seasons hit.
What I was really getting at is whether or not you know, and I take it from your answer so far that you don't, but whether or not there's been any lasting benefits there from what the armed services, our armed services, were doing there during those 10 years, other than the road, the completion of the road.
Lasting benefits in terms of?
Benefit the welfare of the people.
Yes. I was able, on one of my days there in the hill country, to go with one of the colonels who had been the engineer who had directed the building some 10 years ago. So we went back to a stretch of road where that he had built many years before and drove through that stretch of road. The quality of life along that stretch of road, which had been established for some years, was dramatically different than the quality of road in the new section where we were working at the time.
That's what I was getting at.
The people were more affluent in terms of the housing, the services that came into them, the road to travel on. They were able to transport supplies in and out and up and down that road and over the bridges that had been built. And so you could definitely see a difference in the lifestyle of the people on the end of that road that had been established for some years and that section that was not yet completed.
Now, I presume that we all three can agree that the action in Somalia now could be classified as an humanitarian action. Would you agree to that?
Oh, I certainly
Mr.
would,
Travis?
because I think Somalia is what I would think of when you're using military forces in a humanitarian scenario, because you have a region where there's actually no government. And our troops that are in there are really policemen. They're the constabulary to maintain some order so that people can be fed and clothed. And in addition, of course, we're aiding and assisting in the transport of food and I imagine many other types of items for the benefit of those people. To me, that's purely a humanitarian effort.
And I take it you would agree to that, Dr. Cooper?
Yes, basically. I'm not sure if it's purely a humanitarian effort, but it certainly is a humanitarian effort.
Now, my question is, to you, Mr. Travis, first, should we be there?
I really have my doubts about it, because our armed forces do not have that type of a mission. They've never been assigned such a mission. And the instances that Dr. Cooper is referring to me, were incidental to military operations. And it's the same thing in every war we've ever been in. If you look at Korea, it's covered up the roads when we got through with it. And that nation's now one of the most prosperous in the world. And in a sense, by that definition, you could say the Korean War was a great humanitarian effort on the part of the United States and the United Nations, but we didn't feel that way when we were there. That wasn't our mission, that wasn't our goal there. That incidentally, the people of Korea in the long run benefited, but our job when we were there was to kill Chinese. And they were building the roads to get ammunition to the front and to move supplies and that sort of thing. They weren't building for the benefit of the South Koreans. And I'd suggest that even that road in Honduras probably had a military objective because of the insurrection that was existing in those countries, particularly Nicaragua at the time. I bet if you looked at the map, that it would have something to do with the movement of troops, material, and equipment, or the road wouldn't have been built. I'll guarantee it wasn't built just for the benefit of the people of Honduras.
Why do you have doubts that we should be in Somalia now?
Well, the military isn't trained for that. That's not one of their missions and one of their goals. And we've been cutting back on the military since the termination of the so-called Cold War, and obviously there's going to be more cutbacks. And we need to keep those people out of those situations because, first of all, they're not trained for it. Now, these people in Somalia now are basically doing police action, and they're being shot at. And that's what the military is trained for, is to shoot and be shot at. Now, there are some parts of the military that can perform what would be considered humanitarian functions. Engineers, for example, if you want to use them to build roads, or water supply points, quartermaster units, shower units, various types of food service organizations could be used for that. But that's a secondary mission for them, and it's something they're not trained specifically to do. Those troops that are in Somalia now cannot begin to feed the population of Somalia through their equipment and personnel. That what they can do is maintain order, and you have to have with that some sort of civil government to operate. Maybe we have civil affairs units in there, I don't know. I would doubt it from what I've heard, to try to organize some sort of government between those warlords so those people can police and control themselves and perform these necessary services for themselves. We have no business doing it.
I take it, Dr. Cooper, that you think we should be there.
I do, and I think the comparison between what was being done, for instance, in Honduras and Korea is not comparing apples to apples. We were not fighting in Honduras. We were not in battle. Our troops were not at war. We were there for humanitarian aid. The road, I wouldn't argue, might not have some other purposes. However, the purposes for building wells in the villages as we went were not for military purposes. The purposes for building schools for the children that I worked with and that I visited with in these villages, where what schools they had were run-down churches, most of them with thatched roofs and dirt floors. Those schools were for the children and for their benefit. It was not as a secondary aspect of a war that was going on. So it's not the same kind of thing. But the Somalian thing is certainly a different kind of thing than we have ever done before. I don't deny that. And from my perspective, it is the morally correct thing for us to be doing in terms of thousands of people starving to death and the resources available to feed them, but the use of two opposing forces in that country, neither of which represent a government in that country, depriving the people by really stealing that food and black marketing that food for their own advantage and for their own greedy purposes, and at the same time allowing thousands and thousands of people to die. I think that's certainly comes under my concept of what our military should be doing. It seems like to me that I agree that in the past that has certainly not been one of the objectives of our military, but I think that in the future that will certainly become one of the objectives of our military, because we have a changing world scenario, and we are cutting back on the military budget, and we are changing the perspective and the purpose of the military. You're going to see the military used a lot more in drug control and drug prevention than it has been used in the past, and already the Guard units in this country are being used to a greater extent in that for that purpose. You're going to see them being used for policemen, peacekeeping, peacemaking kinds of purposes, rather than blowing up buildings and killing people. And I think, in my book, that's a much better use of military personnel than the other purpose.
Again, I would remind the audience that we would be glad to have your calls, and please call 651-1620 if you have a question for either one of these gentlemen. Now you have opened the gate, so to speak, to the future and the field that I really think I wanted to get into. I wanted to get into what had gone on in the past, but you're talking about future use of troops. Now, if we should be in Somalia, as you think we should be, he has his doubts about it. What about, should we be in Yugoslavia at this particular time, and the turmoil that's going on there? You've got hunger there. You've got various moral laws obviously being broken there. You've got women being raped. You've got people being killed. You've got the apparent desire on various groups to ethnically purify their group by killing all of another group. Now, should we be in Yugoslavia with our armed forces? Well, first of all, if we were there, would that be a humanitarian use of the forces?
I'm not sure if that would be the same thing, because of the military potential that is there to counteract what we would be involved in. But I think that's it's certainly a different scenario than Somalia, where there is no real government and no real established military force and no real security or police, as Mr. Travis mentioned, to see that those who are trying to feed people and help people have the basic needs which all people should have. There's no such establishment for that in that country. So I think it's a little different in the other scenario, but I think we need to be involved there. I'm not sure if we would need to be involved in the same level that we're involved in Somalia. I think they are different instances. I don't think that you can throw a blanket over this thing and go into every situation that would arise in the world. I think there will have to be decisions made on a leadership level of which ones are appropriate for us to be involved in. From what I have read about that, which is limited, I think the kind of atrocities that are being committed against the people of that country and the kind of mentality of ethnic cleansing is the same kind of thing that led us into the Second World War, and that kind of thing has got to be stopped. And I'm not sure what the best way of doing that is. And I'm not sure, I guess in the broadest definition, that could be considered humanitarian aid. But it's certainly not the same thing as sending troops to protect truckloads of food.
Well, but again, you've got people starving there.
That's right.
And one of the problems is failure to get the food in there now.
That's correct.
And you've got bands of armed people, just like you had in Somalia, that are keeping it from being delivered to the various cities and the various people there now.
You've convinced me. That's why I think they should be there. But I think they are two different situations. I think there's a lot. I think politically and militarily, those are two different animals.
Now you've injected another element here that we'll get back to in a minute that I had hoped we would get to, and we got time, we're going to get to it, and that is the matter of leadership and decision. We'll get back to that. But right now I'd like to hear from Mr. Travis. Do you think we should go into Yugoslavia to help stabilize the situation over there?
Absolutely not. And under no terms or conditions should we ever have any personnel in Yugoslavia. It'd be the beginning of another Vietnam, except it'd probably be worse. You know, you've got to remember a little history about Yugoslavia. That's where World War I started. And you would also have to remember World War II, that the Germans very easily overran the country and ran up the swastika, but they never could control it. And they used divisions to try to control Tito's guerrillas, and I think the other guerrilla leader is Mikhailovic, if I recall at that time, and the Germans could not begin to control those people. And if we think that we can go in there now, we could put every soldier and airman the United States has in there, and you couldn't control that country. And to get into it under any terms and conditions is just asking for a long, drawn-out so-called stalemate, where nothing would be accomplished. Yes, it would be humanitarian to stop that, but I don't think we can stop it. We haven't stopped anything in Somalia. You know, the UN doesn't want to go in and replace us now because our troops have done such a good job. But our troops are probably going to come out in the next 2 or 3 months. Then the UN will be there, and the UN usually fails at everything it tries to do. And if it hadn't been for Harry Truman, it would probably failed in Korea. So Somalia, within 6 months or less after the troops leave, will be right back where it was the day before the Marines landed. They will not have changed anything unless they can set up a government. And apparently we're not doing that.
I'd certainly agree with you, unless they can set up a government, or somebody sets up a government before the forces that are stabilizing the country stabilize it, one way or another. Some type of government. They got to have some type of government, or they're going to have some force in there to even feed the people. I agree with you on that.
That's about the most humane thing you can do for people, is set up a good, solid, stable democracy for them. And then these other things can happen. It's like the question of whether or not you give a starving person a fish or teach them to fish. It's the same question. You can't just give them these things and walk away from it. It's a long, long-term investment. And we've seen that in the things that we've meddled in since World War II. And sometimes we've done an outstanding job, and sometimes we've done a rather poor job. And the Somalias and the Yugoslavias are all over this planet. They're just the two that are in the news media now. We've had them forever, and we will probably have them forever. You know, why don't we go in now into Israel?
I was going to raise that question.
You know, for humanitarian purpose. Just look at the news tonight. You know, my gosh, the things that are going on there between the Israelis and the Arabs. That could be justified as humanitarian. But of course, I think, again, we started off with a question of what we were defining and what we meant by humanitarian. And if we talk about providing food and clothing and relief of that sort to people, that is, of course, humanitarian. If we talk about social reform or installing a government, as I say would be a perfect type of humane operation if you could set up the right kind, that's totally something else. But that's not our business to do that. You know, we've led this country since World War II with protecting the free world from international communism. And we just need to pull back a little bit and let our people relax some and take care of our business at home. We have more problems in our cities now on the streets than they have in some of those places. And I've unfortunately had the experience of commanding a battalion of guardsmen in Wrights in Louisville. And it's no fun thing to do. And it's not one of the things you like to do. I'd much preferred being on the front shooting artillery to Chinese than up there with their own people, not knowing whether you're going to have to shoot one of them or hurt them or harm them some way, not knowing who they were or what they were doing. It's a dangerous and it's a terrible situation. But we've got that problem in this country. And I don't think we can send our troops in this country into our cities to establish what is called martial law by some folks just to prevent all the crime that's occurring. But if we want to do something humane for our own country, that's probably the most important thing we could do.
What did you think in regard to the Israeli situation? Should we do something there, or are we on the right course there?
Well, once again, I think that's an entirely different situation. I think we're kind of jumping from one situation to another, each of which are very different and must be dealt with entirely differently. The Israeli government is a solid, entrenched government with policies and procedures for handling what they're handling on their internal affairs. And I'm certainly not expert enough to know what we should be doing in regard to that, but I think that's a very different situation in between the Israeli and the Palestinians, or any group that is involved there. That's a different situation than what's happening in terms of the ethnic cleansing and the really what is becoming a Holocaust in the Yugoslavian situation. And I think that is still a different situation than innocent children starving by the thousands day after day, not because the food's not there, but because we can't deliver the food. I just think each of those are different situations, and we have to have different solutions to each of those problems. But I think that some of those, and I would not say so necessarily in the Israeli situation, but I would in the Somalian situation and probably in the Yugoslavian situation, that we do need to be involved there in a military way. And at what level that is going to be is something that our leaders, our military leaders, and our government leaders have to decide. And the UN has to decide at what level. I think where you have people crying out within that country for intervention, not just a few people, but thousands and thousands and thousands of people crying out for help, and it seems to me that you help when that cry comes out. And it seems, from me, from my faith perspective, when it comes to, Mr. Travis is correct, we're not going to solve all the problems in Somalia, not this trip, and not in a lot more trips. The point for me is, I've worked with social workers, and when you work with the social work system, I worked in an inner city ministry, and there we had people on the streets by the hundreds. And the terminology that is used there is, by social workers often, is that ministers and churches and humanitarian organizations use a Band-Aid approach sometimes to solving those kinds of problems. And it's true, sometimes we do apply a Band-Aid, and that doesn't solve the problem. What Mr. Travis, I think, is talking about is working systemically to solve the problems. And I think we need to do that. But first, sometimes you've got to stop the bleeding before you do anything else. First, you have to give them a fish to eat so they have the energy to put the pole in the water. And I'm in favor of doing both of those things, working both systemically to change the structures that are creating those situations, but also giving the people enough food and protecting them with at least enough security so that they're able to fish. Because you can't fish if someone's running by in the truck with a machine gun shooting you and the fish too.
Well, what you're saying is the United States should be the policeman of the world, then.
No, I'm not saying that. That's putting words in my mouth. I don't agree with that either. I think there are, as I said, I think there are situations where we can effectively become peacemakers and not just peacekeepers. And I think there are other situations where we can't do that.
Well,
I agree with that, but we should do that through the methods we've always used, through diplomacy and foreign aid and that sort of thing, but not through military forces. I think that's what we're discussing.
Well, I understand from news media that there is now developing, if it hasn't already developed, a situation in the Sudan that is as critical as the one in Somalia.
Ethiopia also.
And Ethiopia also.
Correct.
Most of Africa.
Should we send our forces in there?
Again, each one of those situations have to be dealt with. What I would say we should do is provide necessary relief to keep people from starving to death. if we have to use military forces to do that in any particular situation, then we have to look at that situation and see whether it's feasible to do that or not. Those situations are not just developing. Those situations have been around for hundreds and thousands of years, and particularly in my lifetime, those situations have occurred and recurred a number of times. And what I'm saying is that I know this country and this world has the resources to feed the people of this world and to provide the basic necessities for life. And that if we do less than that, from my perspective, we're doing less than what my faith calls me to do. You see, I think we not only have a global economy, we have a global everything. I believe that old story about Noah and the ark is really representative of this earth, and we are the ark. This earth floating in the sea of space is the ark, and we are the animals on it, all the peoples, not just this country or that country or another country, but all of the peoples of this earth. And it's up to us in how we live together on that ark, whether we're going to come out dry on Mount Ararat or not.
I see where you're coming from. I understand you. Again, I would invite the audience to phone in any questions that they have. The number to call, once again, is 651-1620. Let's talk about the situation that developed in Panama and what we did in Panama. Was that an humanitarian action? I'll ask you first, Mr. Travis.
No, I don't think it was. I think it's strictly a military action to get to Manuel Noriega. And there could be differences of opinion whether or not we should have done it in that form or fashion. Of course, I'm one of those that felt we shouldn't have given the Panama Canal away to begin with. So that would give you some idea of how I feel about that. I think we should have kept it.
Why should we have gotten rid of Noriega? What was the basis for wanting to get rid of Noriega?
Well, of course, supposedly he was laundering money for the drug kingpins out of Colombia, and he's also probably more directly involved in a trade and becoming filthy rich from it. But of course, he's not the only one down there that was doing that, and that was obviously the reason that they went after him.
Well, wouldn't you agree that the destruction of the drug traffic and the control of drugs and the keeping it as being used not only in Panama but in this country and other places in the world is a humanitarian purpose?
Absolutely. I think that a good reason for that, and a very good argument for it, would be to keep the drugs out of this country, notwithstanding the rest of the world, just for our own protection. And that's my problem when we talk about using the military forces. I think the military forces should be only used when the national security interests of this country is involved. Now, in some sense, everything that Dr. Cooper talks about is national security interest, but that is with a very broad definition, and I wouldn't use that broad a definition of it because most of the world's starving. Most of the people in this country don't have any concept of what the rest of the world's like, and we don't begin to appreciate how blessed we are and what we have till they see some of these places. But we can't cure all that. We can't even take care of our own problems at the present time.
Dr. Cooper, do you think the action in Panama was a humanitarian action on our part?
I think that'd be stretching it even a little bit for me. However, I would say that the reduction of the drug traffic I think that would be more along the lines of what Mr. Travis was saying earlier in terms of that would be a benefit, a secondary benefit of a military action. It wasn't the reduction of the drug trafficking and the humanitarian effect that might have upon this country was a secondary effect of a military action that was taken in regard to a dictator, basically, in that country, and in regard to the appeal of the people for military intervention, and in regard to our own purposes and our protecting that part of the world, which is important to do for us militarily and strategically and every other way, I guess.
My next question. Is the situation any better in Cuba today than it was before we went there, insofar as drugs is concerned, insofar as employment and the economy of Panama and so forth is concerned?
Oh, that's a good question. I certainly don't know the answer to it. I read reports and hear reports and see reports on the tube that give contradicting positions on that, so I really don't know. Because I take what I see on the TV reports particularly with a grain of salt, because they're the most biased people in the world about everything they report. So I don't pay much attention to that. But what you read, you get two different views. So I think there's a real question as to whether or not it's really helped Panama. It may have helped this country more than it did Panama. And I have no problem helping this country.
Do you have any thoughts about whether the situation is better or about the same or worse than it was after we went in there?
I think the security of the canal is better, and I'm not sure that anything else is any better. I really don't claim to be an expert on that situation and haven't read or thought about that for a while. But I would say that our protection of our concerns there was effective, and but as far as a humanitarian kind of thing, I doubt that.
Let's talk a little bit about the situation, the British situation in Northern Ireland. I realize that Great Britain is wanting to keep Northern Ireland and doesn't want it to become a part of Southern Ireland, but there's also some aspects of a humanitarian purpose for them being there, trying to
Absolutely.
keep them from killing each other and keeping the peace and so forth. And they've been there now better than 10 years, according to my best recollection. Are they accomplishing anything?
I think if I were a British citizen living in that country, I would think they were accomplishing something.
Even though you were a Catholic, you would still think that?
Well, if I were a Protestant, I certainly would think that, because
that's what it's all about.
my life and limb would be being protected. But I also understand, I think I understand something of the hostility and the animosity that the people feel there in regard to their presence. And again, I think that's a different situation, and I'm really certainly not an expert on that one. But the thing that disturbs me most about that whole scenario is that it becomes a battle between two religious groups.
Well, now, that brings me, and one reason I brought up the British situation, that brings us back to Yugoslavia. In essence, you've got the same situation there.
Certainly.
Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And the same thing in Vietnam.
You've got at least 3 dominant religious clashes there, and then some minor ones in addition to the 3 dominant ones. The Serbs are essentially Greek Orthodox. The Croats are essentially Roman Catholics. You've even got a small Protestant element in there, and then you've got the Muslims in there. Now,
that's why they're fighting.
Well, yeah, I think fundamentally that's why, I must agree with you there. I think probably that's correct. Fundamentally, that's why they're fighting. Now,
I'm not sure what you mean by that's why they're fighting.
It's a religious war.
It's a religious war.
No, I don't agree with that. Religion, if you study any one of those religions, you will understand that the kind of atrocities that are being committed in the name of their religion, just as some of the atrocities that have been committed in our religion are not a part of the teaching of that religion.
Oh, I would agree with that, but that doesn't keep it from being a religious war.
Well, no, that does. In my mind, that does. That's using religion as an excuse for the war, but that's not the same as being a religious war. I understand.
Well, I understand what you're saying also, and from your definition, I agree with you. But on the other hand, I think that basically they are justifying their actions by their religion.
That's true. I agree with that.
And from that standpoint, in my view, they are having a religious war.
Well, they are, because that's their unifying and control factor, is their religion.
Now, my question is, my next question is, and I understand that we've got all these humanitarian problems there, and I'm with you. I'd like to see some relief there, and I think the world should be interested in trying to solve some of those problems. But how are we going to do that? You seem to indicate we should have some use of our armed forces over there to try to do something. My question is, how can we do that, given the circumstances as they exist?
I don't have the answer to that one. I think we go back to what Mr. Travis was saying before. How can we fix those problems? They've always been a problem, and we're not going to fix those problems. I agree. Many of the problems have been there for many years, and we're not going to quickly fix those problems. On the other hand, I think it is our moral imperative, and it is based from my religious background, it is a moral imperative that we try. I don't feel people of the Christian faith, from my perspective, at least I don't feel that I, as a Christian, am going to be held accountable for what I accomplish. I think I'm going to be held accountable for what I try to do, and whether it is morally sound and whether it is morally correct. And sometimes I may succeed at that, and sometimes I may fail at that, but I must try to do it.
I wouldn't argue with you about that. My question is, how are you going to try? How can you logically and reasonably try it? I'm not saying we shouldn't try it.
In terms of which situation we're talking about?
I'm talking about the Yugoslavia situation.
Well,
or any other situation where you've got what apparently Mr. Travis and I agree on, and I believe you agree insofar as our definition of what we consider to be a religious war.
Well, I think in Somalia, I think we are doing what we need to be doing.
Yeah, but they haven't got the religious problems there that they've got in Yugoslavia.
Well, yes.
They have some differences,
yes,
but not nothing like Yugoslavia.
Not nothing like they got in Yugoslavia.
The tribal kinds of things that get into their religious backgrounds, which we understand even less than we do in Yugoslavia. But it's true. They're not divided among 3 or 4 of the world's best-known religious groups as they are in Yugoslavia.
I think what we better learn from that situation, Yugoslavia and all these others, we better look at what's happening to our own country. Because I really have a great fear that we're becoming more regionalized and segregated and separated from each other by ethnic groups, and we're going to have real problems in this country in the foreseeable future. Probably from not necessarily the religious point, but it could be that as a part of it. But we're going to have real problems because we're no longer considered the boiling pot and all these people coming in this country, but we're setting up enclaves, huge enclaves, so much different from what the Chinese used to do in the Chinese sections, the Chinatowns of our major cities like San Francisco. But we've got all these groups in this country, and they're not assimilating into the society. And we have a potential for real problems in this country if we aren't careful.
But I think, in response to what you were asking, I think the volatile, the militant groups that we're dealing with there in that situation are the radical spectrum of these religious groups. They are usually the most radical fundamentalist of the religious group. I think there are many other religious Muslims, Orthodox, Christians in those countries that can be a part of the solution if those people can be empowered to help themselves. And I think in some way, and I don't have a simple solution to it, but in some way we need to be a part of empowering the people who are not on the radical fringes, who are often the people who are in control of the military equipment. and can do the most damage to the most innocent of the peoples. So what I'm saying is we need to be, our military or whatever, our diplomatic channels or whatever, the UN, whatever resources we use to work on that problem need to be used to deal with what I would call the silent majority there in putting under control, neutralizing those radical factions that are creating the kind of Holocaust that's going on in that country now.
Any comment, Mr. Travis?
Well, I agree. That's a point well taken. What you're really talking about, again, is military intervention as a police force, not to provide what I consider humanitarian aid. That's back to what I started with originally. The most humane thing you can do for any country or any region is give them a good, stable democracy where they have a voice in the government and it's fair and clean and uncorrupt. Of course, every government's a little bit corrupt, but nothing is perfect. But that's what you could do that would help them the most. I would, when we started, I thought we were talking about humanitarian aid, is going into these countries and providing them with relief and welfare reform and that sort of thing that goes with that. But I agree that we can't go into Yugoslavia or Somalia even for long and be the police force as small as Somalia is. Our welcome will soon be worn out there. It's a whole lot like Mr. Barrickman and I know as lawyers, you get into a divorce between a man and a wife, and next thing you know, they both turn on you.
That's true.
And that's exactly what you get into when you go in these countries. And that's something like that really happened in something very similar in Vietnam, you know. The people are there early, and I used to read those intelligence reports. In fact, I used to brief people on those things at one time. And they considered a religious war. Now, granted, the communists were using it. But again, that's what they used as their basis for doing that. You remember when the monks were burning themselves, the Buddhist monks? And, you know, all over the TV screens in this country. And that didn't have to do with communism. That had to do with using those people and using them and their religion to foster a rebellion.
But the idea of being the world's policeman has a lot of negative concepts to it. I think we can do some policing without becoming the policeman in every situation. And I think that's necessary, and that's going to be in the future, as we were talking about before, a role for our military in this new changing order of the world. We can. You spoke of as lawyers, but yours as lawyers, yours is in a combative kind of role, adversarial role.
That's what we're talking about here over there.
I see those same couples just before they get to the lawyers, and my role is that of reconciler, and I see that as,
well, some
as
lawyers
our
are
role,
too.
Our role in these situations in the world too, to seek not to put the countries in the adversarial role with one another, but to reconcile those countries. And from my religious perspective, that's a part of what we're supposed to be doing as Christians.
Well, apparently, I think perhaps we could agree that there are certain situations where the American military forces should be used for humanitarian purposes. I think even Mr. Travis will admit
there's
that
certain places and times.
Certain places and times that should be done. So I think we can agree on that. Now I'm getting to the last part of what I hope to accomplish by this discussion. Who is to decide when and where is the right time?
Well, the Commander-in-Chief generally has that authority, subject to the restrictions been placed on the executive branch by the Congress.
Does he have that authority under the Constitution?
Yes, he has a great deal of authority. Well, let's say they've assumed it over the years. I've never seen that specifically. I always thought the Constitution said the Congress was required to declare war, but we've seen that change, and then we have all these limits of so many days before they have to pull the troops out and all that sort of thing. But yes, I think the Commander-in-Chief has the authority to do that, just as the Governor of Kentucky, who's the Commander-in-Chief of the Kentucky National Guard, has the authority to mobilize troops and send them in to control cities in times of riots or do the many other things they've done. Strikes in eastern Kentucky particularly, or the situation when the school bus overturned up in, was it Floyd County? And all those little children were drowned. They sent guardsmen up there to provide various services. But the governor's commander-in-chief can do it within a state, and of course I believe the president can do that internationally.
Well, I think under Article 2 of the Constitution, the federal Constitution, it merely says the president is commander-in-chief.
That's right.
And under Section 9 of Article 1 of the Constitution, it is the Congress that is empowered to create the forces,
that's correct,
to finance the forces, to make rules and regulations for their use, and to declare war. So you have a possible conflict there, and I think that's a good question that we can talk about a little bit more shortly. But in the meantime,
we've had that a great deal, since the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
Well, it's been limited since the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
But I think we have to define then what's declaring war, and you're talking about the movement of troops. We're both military men, and we know who's commander-in-chief, and that's who says where we go, when we go. But when you talk about declaring war, that's another thing. That's a different question.
That's on merely one of the elements of control as far as the Congress is concerned. As far as the Congress is concerned under the Constitution, it is the one that's supposed to create the Army, create the Navy, and to make the rules and regulations. And it's specified in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, whereas the only thing that it says in the Constitution about the powers of the President is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Services. But he is merely, according to the Constitution, to direct them after the Congress has authorized their raising and their use and how they're to be used. So you've got a possible conflict there that he's referred to.
But you remember now, we had a police action in Korea. It was not a war. Mr. Truman never had war declared. We never had war declared in Vietnam either.
I understand that.
And if you remember that what really pulled the rug out from under Vietnam was just what you mentioned, Congress cutting back upon the money and the funds going to the South Vietnamese government.
Correct.
So you're right.
We have a call in from Kay Mayfield of Trigg Court. The question is, with all of the culture, moral differences in the leaders of the world, how can anything be worked out?
Very difficult.
You got any ideas, Mr.
No,
Travis?
I really don't.
Short time we've got left here.
I'm somewhat of a student of history, major in history, and I've always been amazed that we operate as well as we do, and particularly in this country when we have so many different cultures. But as a worldwide situation, you mentioned Northern Ireland. I don't know what you do with situations like that, because if the British pull out, you'll have an ethnic cleansing by one side or the other, whichever one's the most powerful.
Dr. Cooper, you got any answer to the lady's question?
I think we have to get leaders together in good faith to work on these problems. We have solved. When you think where we were 10 years ago in regard to the USSR and the kind of conflict that was taking place, a lot of things have changed in the past few years, and I think that comes from a constant and steadfastful kind of working at the problem and doing that in good faith and good trust. And we just have to try and do that with people in all of these religious groups and these nationalities. Working together in good faith is the way things get changed for positive and for good.
Do you think that we can do that through the UN, that the UN is the vehicle for that?
I don't think it's the only vehicle for that, but I think it is a vehicle for that.
Mr. Travis?
Well, the UN has proved to be a good vehicle when it's led by a strong American president, as it was by Harry Truman, as it was by George Bush in Korea and in Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And I have not seen any other instance where the UN has accredited itself well in any of these situations, including Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Croatia, and those countries at the present time.
Well, in one sense of the word, then, you are saying that ultimately, in order to accomplish what Dr. Cooper's been talking about here, that we've got to get back to the President of the United States. He's got to be a strong leader. He's got to do it through the UN.
That's right.
And that according to,
if you're going to do it.
and according to your theory, then the President himself can make that decision, and he's the man to do it.
Well, again, the question is whether or not you make that decision, is how far it goes. When he once runs out of troops and supplies, and if the Congress doesn't appropriate any money for those, he's out of luck. So it's got to be a cooperative effort between the legislative and the executive branch. I really, we run out of time, but I think back to Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam. He never did get the people in this country involved in that war.
Well, I agree with you.
And that's what ruined us. It was guns and butter too. And I remember very well when plywood went out of sight because they were building facilities at Da Nang. And the people in this country never did get behind it because they were not brought into it.
You got any last words of wisdom for the audience, Dr. Cooper?
Just grateful for the opportunity to discuss the problem, because I think it's an important one in our society and one which we're going to hear a lot more about.
It's certainly an important subject, and I certainly appreciate both of you agreeing to be here. I think it's been a very intelligent discussion. I think it's been beneficial, and I thank you very much. I also thank the audience for watching. Good night.